Hi, I'm Rob Pryor, and welcome to Advanced Animal Airbrushing. Today we're going to be doing two projects. The first one will be painting a ram, in which we'll be using all kinds of etching techniques. We'll be using the razor blades, erasers, and we'll be doing most of it freehand. The second one will be a cow superimposed on a painting for the background of wheat field. The techniques that we'll be really concentrating on are for the fur. Now, with this picture, we're going to be doing this half of the picture. The reason is I want to make sure that we have enough time to do this piece and the next piece in this video. If you can do this half we'll be able to do just as easy. I went ahead and painted, let's move that up a little bit, went ahead and painted a flat black background. Okay, with this one, I went ahead and used black. Now normally I say don't use black, but with this one I wanted this to be void. I want this to pop out, and it's just a very nice flat hue. I went ahead also, and I've already drawn out the ram. I'm going to go ahead and peel this off. Again, we'll be working on this half, although I will let some of the spray go on over. The first airbrush I'll be using is an HPC by Iwata. Again, throughout the video I'll be letting you know what tools and what paints I'm using. I'm using golden transparent yellow at the moment. What I'm doing is I'm layering a nice layer of yellow, transparent yellow ochre. Now I am misting a little bit into here. I wouldn't really worry all too much about that at the moment. I have not frisketed off the eyes. I want to be able to do this freehand. I want to break some of this hard edge right there. So I'm going to let my paint do some of that for me. I'm airbrushing a little heavier yellow into the shadows. One thing nice about having the flat black is you can have overspray and it's not going to really matter all that much. Add a little bit of color maybe to it. Using two different kinds of blades. Let's see if I can show you both of these right now. Flat blade and a pointed blade. The pointed blade in my right hand, right here, when I'm sort of waving, is to get finer detail and scratching. The flat blade is to take off more paint at a time and then maybe switch to a finer point by tipping the blade. What I mean by that is, I'll show you. When I want to scratch something flat, I pull with the flat. When I want to maybe start flat and then go to a finer point, I lift up and you can create a finer point. We're going to start. Once again, try and move your picture closer to the point where you can see it. Right now I'm using Crescent scanner board. Something I really like about the Crescent scanner board is a really slick surface, really smooth. You can erase off of it beautifully. Now a lot of times people just get all happy and they start making these scratching and whatnot. You don't want to just start going off and just doing this. You want to, I did this starting here because there's a whole pattern here which I want to start following. But in here I'm going to follow it around. Actually switch X-Acto knives. You can go either way with the X-Acto knife. If you pull, you're going to pull more paint off. If you push, it's a little lighter. Another thing I'm going to be using a lot today is the X-Acto knife. In the picture on the ram's forehead, you'll notice that there isn't a lot of hairline. It looks like more a scruff. Well, that's what we're going to put in there. We're using an electric eraser for this. In this particular one, push down all the way, it spins the fastest. You can release a little bit, it'll spin a little slower, or even a little slower. You can get a little less or a little more, depending upon how hard you push your finger down. It's almost like airbrushing. It's very similar. I want to go ahead, put a little more yellow paint in here. When you're doing an etching piece, you can layer it a little thicker than maybe normal, at least for your first layer. What I'm going to do is, once again, go back to using the flat blade. I'm going to pull off areas now, because I'm getting into shadows which are a little less defined. You notice I get up here, and this is very, very defined area around the nose. Right here is very defined, and it breaks into the shadows real nicely. But here, again, it's almost mottled. So I'm using the flat of the blade to take away slightly more paint. Don't follow a set pattern. A lot of people like to just straight lines and there you have it and that's your hair. It's not the way to do hair. If you've seen some of the other videos that I've got, you'll know that I constantly am stating when doing hair, it's not a regimented pattern. It just sort of follows a bunch of little patterns all set together. So it's not just a bunch of straight lines all set next to each other. You notice this area here, it's got some, right here that I've been working on, it's got some brush stroke or some eraser strokes that you can see, and then it goes back to that flat blade. Again, this is why I like using this blade, is you get it closer, maybe say to the horn. You can add a little bit more like that. Now, what I'm doing is I'm going to go in, I'm going to put all my initial scratching in. Starting with this, I'll go a little bit more down here. Follow the detail right around in here. Remember, don't get caught in that trap where you're making all your hair exactly in a set pattern. That's the worst thing you can do. What you're doing is you're using this picture, and I've stated this in all my advanced tapes, it's like a map, it's a road map, you're following it. If you follow it exactly, you'll get a photorealistic picture and you'll achieve the effect that you want. Sometimes you don't want, sometimes you may want to add your own bits and pieces, and that's fine. Again, it's the exact same. Now, I'm laying out my piece, I'm doing the detailing. Now, a lot of this is going to be covered and then gone back over, and then covered and then gone back over. You're going to build this up slowly. You're going to keep going over it and going over it until you build up to exactly what it is that you want it to look like. Notice this is almost layers, by the way, layer, layer. Let's see if you can see this at home. Layer here. Okay, layer here. And as it goes down, you'll see in the picture, there's almost different layers. You start setting those in slowly. Nothing happens fast in a painting. You know, correct painting may take you 30, 40 hours. It may be less. You know, it's up to you how much time you want to spend on it. You can never spend too much time when you're just practicing. When you're actually working for a company, you may be set a set schedule and may not have the luxury of a lot of time. It's very easy to get in that hair trap and pattern where you would just follow that same pattern. You get bored with making your etching marks, so you just start going like a robot. You don't want to do that. Every section of this is going to be important. All right, we're going to go here on and come back in, say, about 5 minutes, and that will allow me to have all this done by the time you guys see this. You'll notice, come back, I've went ahead and done all this. This is a little rougher. Still got a little bit of etching to do with this color, but before I went on, you'll notice this is a yellow, and then the board is actually white. So you're not seeing a whole lot of detail build up yet. What I've done is I went in and modeled with a number 2 pencil eraser the photo right around in this area here, getting it ready. It's not a lot of sharp lines, so you don't need to do a whole lot of etching there. Going back to my flat blade. And just throwing in the basic thicker etching right in there. One more time, maybe with actually come in with the nose just a bit. Notice that right around the nose area, if you can see the picture there, you'll notice that it looks a little more hairy. It's because the hair gets a little thinner through that area and therefore looks more singular. On with the eraser. This whole piece is done with etching out the paint for the most part. We may go in at the end and throw a little bit more, maybe some actual paintbrush work. Whoops, always have a free hand to catch your picture when it falls. Now I'm deadening that white just a little bit by spraying that same yellow over top of it before I go on to my next color. Spray that out. And we're going to go in with something that you've really got to remember when you're doing this etching technique is you're etching down to either the color that you just sprayed or to the board. So every color you spray over top will change whether it's sprayed over the yellow. This next color I'm actually going to spray is a mixture of red iron oxide and burnt umber hue by Golden. When I spray this over top the yellow, it's going to take on one kind of color. When I mist it over the white that I've etched out, it's going to take over another kind of color. It's very, very important to remember. Again, move my little road map here a little closer. I'm going to start by spraying this in the eye area. Down in here. This is a little bit more red. When you want to mix it, just plug up the top, pull back a little bit. Your colors will mix when you mix them inside the brush. Cutting in with some of my detail here, my detail shadow. If you cover up some of your etching points, that's okay. That's what you're going to have to do in order to get layers of fur or hair. Again, we're doing all of this with no frisket. It's all freehand. reason I want to go freehand on this animal, or on most animals I do, is you're going to get more of a natural feel. You're not going to get this friskety, stiff, rigid feeling. It's an animal. It's got to look alive. So if you use too much frisket, you're going to kill a lot of that look to your animal. Also, if you're erasing, sometimes the eraser will get on the black outside. Just get a brush and we'll go ahead and wipe that off. Starting to give a little bit of depth to everything. Right in here, there's a little bit of almost a little curly, fuzzy look. Just do little circles with your brush. We'll go back in and actually carve those out a little bit more with an X-Acto knife or an eraser. Get a little bit more up here. It's almost a scribbling technique that I showed on my very first video. Just get in real close and just sort of scribble. What I'm doing, I put down some paint. I want to get a nice edge. I want to get a little bit more of a depth in there. I go ahead and spray some paint down and I sort of pull it. And that gives me not quite a hard edge, but it gives me a nice solid edge. If you get a little too much paint on there, just dot it off with your finger. It's awful hard to make mistakes when doing an animal because you've got layers of fur, you've got a lot of different things happening. The last thing you need to worry about is making a big mistake, because it can always be very easily covered up. Switching to X-Acto knife now. Now you don't want to go in real heavy because you don't want to cut all the way down to the white necessarily on all of it. So you're going to be pulling very lightly with your X-Acto knife. If you get too much on there, now you can still neutralize your brush or your X-Acto knife strokes by spraying a little color over top of them. But work back and forth with your airbrush and your X-Acto knife at this point. You're going to see a lot of colors you want to etch into. And you may also say that some of the areas aren't quite dark enough. Now, you'll notice right here, when you etch something up, you're going to have some paint right there. You may have to wipe your X-Acto blade off after a little while. It's going to build up. Once again, right over this area. This is all the fur right here. Try not to jump around too fast. So right in this area. Just got to go over the darker area. Once again, I'm changing direction of fur. Wipe my blade off. Changing the direction. I want to make my fur a little whiter. I pull with the X-Acto knife. If I want to make it thinner and don't cut through the paint so much, I push. Push this way, pull this way for more paint to take off, push this way for less. Little delicate area here. Sometimes you can just get away with just putting fur, you know, down. Other times, you really got to sort of illustrate. Around in here, you're really illustrating how you have to have this, because the features are very definite when it gets around that area. Very thin hair around there too, so I'm pushing. Trying not to take off too much paint. I still have to go in there with very, very tiny fur in there. Now I can see my original fur strokes in there. Here's where I'm going to use a little bit more of the flat edge. Maybe go in here and do that. Yeah, I'm still using the exact same colors that I was using for my colors. To remind you one more time, it's a raw umber and a red iron oxide by Golden Paint. I'm doing some scribbling in here now because I don't want to add just too much dark color, yet I want to get a nice sort of fluffy look. If you can get a fluffy look to it, I suppose. Doing that same thing. I'm doing that in a lot of different places because you want to start giving texture underneath where you're going to be doing your stroke for whatever eraser technique or etching technique you might be using. Also, it helps layer where you're going to be doing a lot of your work. You're using that roadmap to let yourself know where you're going to be working next. Now, when I say Golden Paint, that's the brand name. They have several different kinds. This particular instance, I'm using a transparent paint. They're a transparent line. It's very thin and allows me to get a lot of that detail by building up the paint slowly, layer by layer, rather than just spraying it on in one coat and being done with it. Now, notice here I'm shaking my brush. I want to get a real sketchy color overlay down there. Okay, I'm going to go in here, again scribbling. Now I'm going to go into the eye just a little bit. It's interesting because you've got to make this look sort of, well, you got to make it look photorealistic using 3D, but you've got to nicely combine the combination between etching and airbrushing, knowing what to darken, when to darken it, what you just scratched out, whether it's got to be changed for, like right around in the upper part here. I went ahead and just etched this out, but I'm going to have to go back lightly over top of it just so I can take the white part that I just etched out and change the color just slightly. Let's go back down here. Oops. There we go. See, once again, it's fur. You don't have to be exactly precise, especially when you're getting down into the non-descript area of your painting. You can just sort of go wild down here and scribble and whatnot. I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of my scribbling technique and come back in about 5 minutes, and I will do nothing except for the scribbling technique which I have showed you. Start back with my etching when you guys come back, and we'll go on from there. Hi, welcome back. you'll notice now that I went ahead, did very little actually since you sort of disappeared there, and put some of this in right in here. Again, just larger scribbling. That's all that really is. A lot of like blotchy. Went back in here with a little bit more scribbling, a little darker in here. Before I go any further with the actual fur, I want to go ahead and start working on the horns because they lay behind the fur. What I've got in here is a shading gray, again by Golden, and a little bit of raw umber, again by Golden Paints. I use a lot of different kinds of paint. But every artist you'll find, and you yourselves at home, will come up to having favorite kinds of paint and whatnot. Once you find like a paint that you really like, you need to try all kinds of different paints, by the way. It's not just something, you need to really practice it. Now you'll notice I'm going into all of the nice little grooves. I'm going to do that through the whole horn. A little darker down here. I'm going to etch out my detail in just a second here, but I want to go ahead and darken all of it first. Again, you're going to need a nice sturdy easel for working at home, studio, or whatever. The easel I'm working on is the Martin U180, Martin Universal U180. And a very sturdy easel. That's important. And you've also got to be very used to and comfortable with everything that you're using. It's so important to make sure that if you're uncomfortable while you're painting, most of the time your paintings will reflect that. And it is definitely, you want to reflect good things about your paintings, not how uncomfortable you were at painting them. And believe me, it can show very thoroughly. You'll notice, again, I have no frisket on the outside edges. A lot of the flat black that I'm using is catching that. That's one of the reasons that I went with the flat black. It's going to catch a lot of the overspray. It's also going to allow me to help not make this seem so rigid. Right now it's seeming very, very rigid, or with very, very solid edge. We'll be changing that. Laid my first coat of gray down. I'm going to go in with the electric eraser. Start picking out my highlights. Try and follow that as close as possible. Here's something, an interesting note. Let's see if we can go to the picture here. You'll notice, and this might be very hard for you to see, but there are definite indents in the horn. Wherever your light source is, if you have a dip and your light source is coming from this angle, your highlight will be on the opposite side of your light source. If you have a hump, it will be on the same side as your light source. It's important to remember, especially when you're doing something like this, because you have both the indents and the bumps to contend with on this particular piece. I went ahead and just did this little area right here. I'm going to the X-Acto knife now. You got to be very careful when you're doing X-Acto knife work here. don't want to scratch away too much paint. Now this is a little bright, but I'm going to be going back in here and going over it with my colors one more time so it won't seem quite as bright. Now, I'm only using about half speed on my electric eraser here. Every now and then I'll kick it up when I want to take a little bit more paint off there. In this particular instance, there's a very rough surface. Your electric eraser will tend to pull your hand. That's a good thing in this particular instance because you don't have to worry about as much control. You can sort of just move it around and let it pull your hand around just slightly. Coming up to the very highlighted area. I'm going to change this just slightly. Blow off some of the... I want to move my shadow up a bit. I noticed by the picture that it's up just a little bit higher. This sort of allows me, I'm going to get a chance to go back into this area here. Darken this a little bit. Darken some of my indents and shadow areas. I'm going to take some of this color also and go into the fur, because there is shading gray in the fur. We'll get to that in just a second or two. When you want to be a little lighter, not so crisp, make sure you can back your airbrush up some and it won't be nearly as bright. Once again, give that a second or two to dry. I'll start my work down here a little bit. Once again, picking up some of those highlights that are just the brightest. Very important to learn to get to control your electric eraser. Get to know, just as important to know that, especially when doing an eraser piece. It's just important to know that as it is to do any of the airbrushing or etching with the razor. It's got to have a real nice light touch and control with the finger. I cannot state how important that is. Without the correct control of the electric eraser, you're just going to get a lot of blotchy lines. See right here, the eraser's fighting against me. It's rolling this way, wanting to come up, and I'm coming down with the lines. Now, another thing, your edges will get rather rounded. What I'm doing now is I've lengthened my eraser, taking an X-Acto knife, cutting it sharp. That will allow me to have a little bit sharper edge for the areas right here that I want to bring in there. If you let it roll like this also, you'll notice if you take a close look at the photograph, see if we can pop that up there, you notice that there's a lot of little indents and bumps. But compared to what I'm doing, I'm letting it bounce. Okay, if you'll notice right up in the horn area, there's just a lot of little indents. How I'm getting that, once again, is just letting the eraser sort of bounce as it's going up. You let the eraser do a lot of the work for you. I mean, it's amazing some of the accidental techniques you'll get just by letting the eraser do something. What I'm doing like here is just I'm scrubbing with the flat end of the eraser to get almost a sandpaper look. How fast you kick it on is, I mean, that's well, sounds like a bee or a dentist drill, but that's an exciting experience to remember, I'm sure. See how nice and textured that's becoming. All right, I'm going to once again step away for about 5 minutes, finish exactly what you've seen here all the way through. And when you come back, this will be ready for the very next step.
Now what I've went ahead and done is
all the nice little eraser work. I've also found a piece of frisket laying down there. I went ahead and caught that up to speed by spraying the yellow back over the white. I peeled it off and went ahead and sprayed it just to pop it up and catch it up. I'm going to take some of this shading gray now and spray it into the picture just a little bit to catch the rest of the picture up with the horn. Again, this is going to be covering a lot of what you've done, but you still need to keep doing, you know, all the steps that were before this were extremely important. Again, it's all a big puzzle, and you, the artist, have to put it together. You can use that picture just like a road map. We use a air filtration system when painting, just for safety's sake. In this particular instance, we have the Aэрograph. Sometimes it gets pretty nasty breathing a lot of the fumes. I know a lot of artists don't care. But you really should use some sort of system to keep the air fairly clean. Again, darkening up this area right here. You can go ahead and use a scribbling technique into it. However, since this is shading gray, I'm mostly just using it to do some shading. That's just about what I'm doing. It's covering certain areas, putting some of maybe the folds in the ram's skin or fur. Put a little bit more in there. All the paint that I've used so far has all been transparent. Now I'm going back into the horn. See if I can get this up there so you guys can see it a little bit better. Adding just my darker parts right now. Some of the areas need to be shaded just a little bit more. Right in here, I want to shade that. Bring it up here just a little bit. Maybe do this in some areas because I want to make some of those indents a little more prevalent. Give it a nice texture. All I'm doing is letting the paint flow a little bit and just moving my airbrush, my hand back and forth like this in really quick motion. Down here it's a little more nondescript. You can sort of play around with that just a bit. The edge of the horn. Let's get a little color into that. Got the Vega 2000 here. Spin this around so I don't get it completely tangled up. Got a little bit of that original brown color we were using right there. Notice how it's almost got that yellowish brown appearance. A lot of that has to do with the natural color of the horn. A lot of that has to do with maybe with the photograph the light was strong enough to reflect the natural color of the ram onto the horn. Whatever the reason, you don't want to leave the horn just a shading gray. It's got other colors in it. In fact, it's just got a tinge of blue also, which we're going to be adding in just a second here. I'm going to put a little bit of red iron oxide, just pure red iron oxide in here. Some nice coloring in there. Get into some of the depth with some of that. Maybe spray some of it back into the picture. Make sure I don't lose any of that nice rich color. And just because we can, got to find the right color of blue here. I'm using a phthalo blue, slightly green shade. Transparent paint once again, mixed with a little bit of the red iron oxide. A little bit more. Mix it up again. I sort of just cup the top of the paintbrush, pull back just a little bit. Oops. There we go. And just throw it in just ever so lightly into the shadow areas mostly. You don't want this to be too strong. Go back into a little bit. Actually, I'm going to switch to the X-Acto knife. get some of those highlights picked back out. Once again, we're going to go on to a pause here for just a few seconds. Only thing I'm going to do now, that I'll explain real quick before I go on pause, is to go back in and etch some of my highlights out. I'm going to start here and move all the way back. I'm finishing up just a little bit of the electric eraser here. Again, just nice highlighted. Follow this all the way down. That is just a little too stark. So what I want to do now, take a little bit of shading gray. Oh, we're a little tangled up here. Take a little bit of the shading gray, go over it just lightly. And then now I'm going to add, there's just like a drop or two of shading gray left in here. I'm going to add, you don't want to add that one. You want to add transparent yellow ochre. There we go. That's exactly what we want. Gives me a little bit of that darkness of the shading gray, and yet when I kick it back to about here, it's got a nice yellow hue to it. Going through some of the cracks just real quick. Notice I just made scratches here and there. I wanted to make it appear natural. The horn is actually very, very scratchy looking. Now I'm going to go ahead, start cutting back in with my detail on the fur. I'll start with this area here. This is really going to be careful what you have to do here. That's because you're going to be going back and forth a little bit, throwing in some, let's add some red iron oxide to that. I'm still using that, it's that shading gray yellow mix. I'm adding some red iron oxide to it to liven it up just a bit. I'm going to go back and forth quite a bit here between brush and X-Acto knife. So when you paint's laid on there a little thicker, such in this area, you'll only etch down to, say, the next layer of paint. Now, I'm not following any exact hairline here. I'm following their these nice random patterns that they've got on the animal here. I'm going back in with just a light spray so it's not so stark. What I mean by stark is just so you don't pick up all that white that white fur, and it's very unrealistic. Now this has got a nice round part to the ram right here. We want to make that. I'm skipping back and forth between here and here because I'm sort of working my way into the middle. I want to get there's an area here I want to make sure we've got down. This is the area that comes into the nose. It actually starts the rounding of the nose towards the forehead, in between the eyes. I want to make sure that that was in there because that builds right up into the strongest highlights on the fur itself. Now I'm going in between some of my fur areas, just layering some of the. This gives it a little bit more of a mottled look with the fur right in here, especially. You can tell right that it gets a little darker in the fur, just by going and making. Again, almost a scribbling technique, except maybe a little more liney. And this is my favorite X-Acto knife to use, is the flat edge, because of the different things that it can do. But make sure you try, both. Make sure you try several different kinds. You might find there's some round tip X-Acto knives. There are all kinds of things like that. You can find. Sometimes when you're etching like this, again, you'll peel up a lot of this paint, and you won't catch it all, and you'll leave little paint balls on there. Sometimes they do wonders for the painting. As a matter of fact, you can actually use them to your advantage. See now it's getting a nice look in there. You start building this all the way down. I'm going to take a number 2 pencil, a brand new one actually. Do a little erasing in circular motions to create some of that hair in clumps. So I'm actually etching out of a. And I'm actually going to go up in here a little bit too. And a nice uneven look. The most important thing, I suppose, on an animal is again not to look, not to make it too mechanical. Don't take away some of the essence of the animal. Where you're I guess de-animalizing it, if that's a word. You want to get nice mottled. It's not. And what I mean by mottled is it's brown, dark brown, light. And then you etch over top of that, and you get a real nice look to it. The eraser on the nose area. Again, we haven't used any opaque paint on this yet whatsoever, and we may not. We may not need to. Down in here, I'm going to use the notice I'm just lightly rubbing it on there like that with it turning. Gives it a, once again, a very mottled look. Okay, let's go into this area real quick here. Right in here, the fur over the horn is going to give it that layered appearance. That's very, very important. Then it gets dark in here, so we'll go back and spray some of that. See, that's a good thing about having the airbrush in one hand and the X-Acto knife in another, is you can go back and change it whenever you want. in. I don't want that to be too prevalent. Don't want it to stick out too much. If you get it looking like it's sticking out too much, it's just not going to have a natural feel to it. Again, I'm going to skip real quick to down here just slightly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the edge here. Take my electric eraser. Very lightly. Let the electric eraser do the work for you. It'll pull your hand. That too dark. Here's a part you've got to be very careful on, because the hair is extremely light, or actually extremely dark, so your hair strokes with your X-Acto knife have to be light. What I've done is I've turned my X-Acto knife just a hair more flat. Now you got to be careful, because if you tip it too much, you'll catch the edge on something. But if I tip it a little more flat, I'm not pulling up those sharp lines. I'm also applying so little pressure right now. All right, now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause for, I'd say, about another 5 minutes. Here's how I'm going to explain what I'm going to do. This area right here that I'm working on now, I'm going to carry that down and through here. I'm going to go ahead and finish up my strokes right here. Finish up some of the strokes right here. When we come back, I'll show you how to layer the correct color of paint over. We'll finish the eye, put the finishing highlights on, and we will be done. See you in 5. Now, I went ahead, I've taken a pencil eraser, taken off my highlights for the fur right here, taking off my highlights for the fur here and here, all up here. Now you notice it's still got a very hard edge except for right here. It's got a very hard edge. We're going to take care of that in just a second here. I went ahead, taking some of it down in here. I'm going to now go in very lightly, spray over my just 2 white areas, just something that's a little too white. The eye is a little more green, so I'm getting a little tangled up here again. I went ahead and did that. I'm going to dump out some of that color, and we're going to add a little bit of white to that. Now we are using some opaque white. I'm just ghost misting over my edge here, shaking my hand a little bit to get a little bit of a fuzzy kind of look, I suppose. See, that gives it a little bit of a slightly more natural feel. I'm going to go ahead with this white just a little bit into the whole thing, so you just don't have it in one little area. That's something that if you get a little too much, we're going to go back in with brown one more time anyway. But you don't want to just put something in one area and then be done with it. Always check your brush. If for some reason you are spraying and you're just pressing for air and paint's coming out, something is probably wrong with your brush. Check it, take it apart, whatever you do, make sure you get that. Taking that white back into the painting just a little bit. Nose. If you get a little too spotty or something, just sort of go and you can wet your finger down. Now we're adding some of the nice highlights here. I'm bringing that down just a bit just because I want to break up some of that stark line work there. We rinse this out. Finally, I'm going to put in some straight raw umber. It's got a little bit of a greenish hue to it. Anywhere that I don't want that white, I'm going to go in with that. Anything that I've got to... Now this is a transparent paint that I'm using also, I'll let you know that. I think I need to darken up maybe. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to throw just a little bit of shading gray into that, darken that brown up a little bit. Again, this is all transparent. At the end of this tape, you'll see this painting completed. Closer look there. Step back for a second. And there we go. This is the finished ram piece. Let's move on to our next project. On to our next project. We're taking a slightly lighter approach here, and we're also accomplishing something else. The first project was taking a photo, making it photorealistic, learning how to do your scratch out techniques. Here, we're going to be doing mostly opaque. Let's get the photo up here. I went ahead and painted in the background just some blue paint. It's a little white for clouds. Took a brush, just the background. The background of the wheat. It's very yellow right down here. We'll be using a fan brush on this piece. Some other paintbrush work. A lot of yellow in this piece. I'm also doing this without frisket. I don't want to, once again, to give the cow a very hard edge when I start painting him. Also, you'll notice that it's cut off right down there. At the end of the painting, you'll notice when you see all the pieces finished, you'll notice that I'll have wheat dragged up over top that. Since this is an animal video, I won't be necessarily showing you those. I want to make sure you guys understand what you bought the video for, which is learning how to do animals. This is a very, very sort of commercial, humorous kind of approach to what we're doing here. What I've done is I mixed carbon black, shading gray, and raw umber. Still not quite right. Then I'm to lighten that up just a bit more. I'm adding some burnt sienna. Let's see if that's more of what we want right there. What I'm doing now is I'm just going into a lot of the shadowy areas. Since we're doing more of an opaque piece, you don't have to worry so much about overspray, just like into your other areas. However, you don't want to get crazy with the overspray. So you've got to keep a little bit of a tight control on it. But you don't have to sweat it out too much. What I'm doing is I'm laying my road map down. All this color is right now is just basically, like I said, it's basically road mapping. Adding a little darkness to the areas that we need to add a little bit of darkness to. Go ahead with the ear. I'm going to shade in this area right here. I'm going to be going into this area with maybe a dioxide purple black mixture. So it's not fully darkened to the point where I'm going to take it to it yet. Again, this is a much more opaque piece than we just did. And also, it's not just going to be a floating head of a cow. I am going to put some wheat over this to set him in this almost a wheat field kind of feeling to the painting. I'm going to finish up shading under here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw in a little transparent red. I'm going to go ahead and darken this edge up right into the field right here. Fade that down. I'm going to throw a few things that will just help blend it a bit. Go ahead and rinse this out. I'm going to throw some red iron oxide in there. In this particular case, I am going to be using a transparent paint. Again, sometimes you have to take into consideration your client might want something a little more colorful or a little more fun. So you always want to try and take slightly different approaches to what you think your client might want when you're doing, especially when you're doing roughs or whatever it is that you may be doing for them. Okay, we missed this ear. We're going to come back in with the darker color in a sec or two. Let's throw a little bit of that in there, like that. Now I'm going to go into the nose with a little bit of transparent magenta. Let's see if that's the color I want. That might be, well, that's about right there. Some nice magenta in there, giving that pink feeling in the nose. We can neutralize this to make it a little bit more orange. I've got to go back in with yellow one more time anyway, along with several other types of colors. Going around the edges slightly on the darker brown, and that because this happens to be a little bit more out of focus, so it's got a little bit of a fuzzy edge around a lot of the parts. See, here and here are just a little too bright for what I may want. But you know, if you get too bright in one area or another, a lot of people start to panic or whatever. Don't. It's not a panic situation, trust me. You just learn to neutralize your colors a bit. Again, I've explained this on other videos, but in case you've just got this video, I'll explain what I mean by that. Neutralizing a color either means dulling it down with another color or dulling it down in one form or another, changing it in one form or another. Here I'm adding yellow, or actually a yellow oxide to most of this piece right now. It was a very thoroughly drawn out piece. Normally I don't necessarily go into a piece with this much pencil line work. For expedience sake, I have on the video. I think the point that I'm trying to make is you might want to, project it up. You may not have to go in and do all the little bits and pieces here and there. However, depending upon your time constraint and whatever it is that you might be working on, you may have to. It's just it's a part of sort of the art game. You might not see the pencil line quite as much from where you are. Trust me, it's there. And in this particular case, it's a good thing, once again, like I said, because I am hurrying through this piece a bit. Tighten up my air hose. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my fan brush. What I mean by a fan brush is you'll notice that it's fanned out. It's very important to get a little test surface here. There we go. Let's see if this is right. What you're doing is you're adding in your edges and your fur. With your fan brush, and you're going to draw that right into. You don't want to get it too wet on there. See, this is what I meant by. Now I'm just doing this. We're gonna go back over this. This is almost an unnecessary step, but I want you to see how what I was talking about. We'll go back in and cover a lot of that, so we won't have to worry so much about it. Fan brushes can be tricky because you don't want to necessarily always use the whole fan brush. You sometimes want to tilt it to the side to get just a few, brush strokes in there. You don't want to get it real even. One of my very first videos, I did a tiger. I used a fan brush a lot on that. You can't get a fan brush too full of paint because then you won't get the desired effect. You sort of got to play around with it till you get exactly what it is you want to get out of it. Let's make it a little bit more white. When you're working with, there we go. When you're working with opaque paints and you're working with paint brushes, a lot of times you're going to want to have a scrap piece. You don't always want to use the reference piece, but you want to have a scrap piece around. See if I can turn here for you guys at home a little bit. Now this is awful stark white that I'm using here. I'm going to tone that down just like we did in the first project. We're working opposite that we did. I'll take my finger and smear it a little bit. Here you aren't carving exact lines with the X-Acto knife. You're putting them on with a paintbrush. Now you can use your finger to smear the paint so it's not so strict in there. Let's say you got a little bit too much there. You just go right in and wipe it off. That's the good thing about making it more opaque. There's advantages to both. I use both constantly. And there's disadvantages. It depends. It depends on what, maybe you don't feel like using a X-Acto knife that day, and it might be just that, and that might be the only reason you don't use it. It might be it may not fit the project. You never really know if it will or not until you've practiced both thoroughly, and you'll know when it comes up, actually, after you get the feel of both. But it takes a little bit of practice. So you're thinking, well, should I do a scratching technique or should I do a paintbrush technique? Tell you one more time, it doesn't really matter as long as you're comfortable with what you're doing. It looks like on the photo here they almost dyed this cow's hair. A little bit of runoff there. See, you can do some really nice brush strokes for hair and stuff with a fan brush. Just make sure you don't get all set and even. There we go. There's a little bit of hair up there. All right. One thing is you got to rinse your fan brush out fairly thoroughly, because if you don't, nice water in there. If you don't rinse it out thoroughly, it's going to get all clogged up on you, and you don't want that to happen. I'm mixing some shading gray, raw umber, a very little bit of dioxide purple, and then a little bit of carbon black. Now I always say don't use black. Most of the time what I mean is don't use straight black. It's a very, very flat hue. It's not even a color, it's a hue. Let's move that over to this side. I'm going to go from this ear, here, filling in all my darkest points, over to here, fill in this side, and then down here. This is just so I can darken up the area a bit. On this ear, it's not going to matter as much. Here I layered the brown because I'm going to leave some of that show through over here. Here I'm not so worried about it. I've got my yellow that's already on my base. What I will have to do though is make my color mixture that I've just mixed up a little darker. If that happens, you get a little bit too much spray, just wipe it off with your finger and keep going. Not a big deal. Somebody once again said to me that I shouldn't admit mistakes or whatever on video. I'll tell you right now, if you don't make mistakes, you're not human. You're going to make mistakes. I don't care if you're at a convention or doing t-shirts. Someone is going to see you make a mistake. The idea is not to not make mistakes. If you think that you're going to get into the art career, airbrushing or whatever, and not make mistakes, you're wrong. The idea is to learn how to cover those mistakes. That is the true sign of a professional, is to learn to cover your mistakes. We're going to go ahead for a pause here just for a second. I'm going to fill in the rest of this area and this area down here. When you come back, that'll all be filled in. We went ahead and sprayed all the areas the darker color. Put the picture back up. And now, I went ahead with that same dark color and put it on my fan brush. Now, a lot of problems that, if you'll take a look at a lot of airbrushers out there, you can tell where the frisket lines are. That can present a horrible problem most of the time because it doesn't look natural. Now sometimes you can have it and it's going to look okay. You need a nice sharp crisp line, but when you're doing like animals, sometimes even humans, whatever, you don't want that edge line. So here what I'm doing is I'm taking the fan brush, just putting just a little tiny bit almost like fuzz on the edge. Do that right up here. He's got some darker, longer hair up there. Into the area here in the hair, in the ear, I mean. You can turn the fan brush the other way, get some thicker strokes. Again, around the ear. Got a little bit of overspray up here. That's all right. Don't worry about it. It sort of gives it slightly focusing or out of focus look. Once again, around that cut line edge right there. We can make our cow seem just a little more real. Right around the edges down here. Don't be afraid to use your finger and smudge and smear a little bit. Remember, you're doing a painting. You know, with the techniques that I'm showing is, I want you to feel a little bit more relaxed using other mediums than just the airbrush. Now something I'm going to do is I'm going to put just brown. So that way it's not quite, oops. Let's see that. There we go. Just like a brown, so it's not quite so so dark. I'll put those areas in. Again, just use your finger and just getting some paint on there and just smudging it around a little bit. Rinse off my brush. One more thing we're going to put on this is some white. Go back in with some white. Again, we're going to change the color of this white so it's not so stark against the picture. But I want to go ahead and bring some of that white up into the painting, actually. Right around the edge there. You don't always want to destroy your photo references, and if you think you're going to, like in this instance, go get a photocopy made, and that way if you destroy it, you've still got your original, and you can go photocopy it again if need be. A couple of good things about photocopies is, of course, you can make as many as you want. However, make sure it's a nice, crisp, clear photocopy. You don't want to, I'm going to go ahead and add some texture inside there for the cow. You know, if you get a rough photocopy, it is sometimes a deterrent to use a photocopy. And if you are doing a color picture, it's probably best to get a photo color copy. Copy photo. See how that's adding a little bit of texture in there? There we go. Give your cow picture a little more life. It's going to look a little stark, but that's okay. So we're going to change that in just a second. Rinse off the brush. Oops. Switching to a Hannis yellow. This is more of a, I guess, a greenish, brighter yellow. And that's what I see right around in this area, so that's what we're gonna put in the hair area. This just sort of helps brighten it up a bit. Now, since this is more of an opaque piece, I'm going to go ahead and put some opaque white in there. Mix it with the yellow just a bit. This is really going to start to bring the picture to life a bit. Soften those edges. Now once again, this isn't my final white on here. What this is just softening up what I've got. I'm going to go back in with yellow and cover a lot of this. But this is just to soften it a bit. You know, if you got maybe just a little too harsher with your lines, or you want to take it slightly out of focus, this is what this is allowing you to do. I'm going to throw a little bit more yellow into the fur, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Do some white down there. There is just a little bit of almost a whitish brown on the actual photo itself. Barely, you can just barely see it. We're going to put some of it in anyway. Rinsing some of my white out. We're going to move to a burnt sienna hue. This is more of a transparent color. Something you gotta be careful of: if you switch from a transparent color to a opaque color, you notice that opaque colors are a heck of a lot thicker. So you might find it's a little different when you switch, so it's going to be a little thicker or a little thinner. covering all my white areas that I don't want to stand out too much. I'm going to go real quickly to a transparent yellow oxide. A little too bright there, way too bright there. Let's tone this stuff down here just a little bit. Got a little bit of excess water there, getting that off. Going in with a shading gray. Any overspray you might want to wipe out with the shading gray. It's a good time to do it. All right, we're going back in with white one more time. Doing a couple highlighted areas. It's not really a straight white, there's a little bit of blue in it. Rinse this out. Get a little bit of white into my little palette here. Go into my areas that are going to need just a little bit of brush work for highlighting. Lips of the cow, possibly. If cows have lips. Turning up the edge of the nose right here. Now something I'm going to do real quick is just to start, I'm going to mix a little bit of white, and I can always tone these down just a bit. Start to put in my field of wheat over top my cow. You start, since this is the close-up of the cow's standing closer to you, you can start all the way from the bottom, pull your wheat up. Make sure that you don't put them all in straight lines across it. It's not going to look natural that way. The cow's supposed to be wading through the wheat. So I doubt that the wheat is going to fall perfectly for him or her. Just put my wheat stalks in. I'm going to change the color on this just a bit, and I may even fade the background ones off a little bit more. I'm just going to give you a quick example of what you want to do is, and we're just going to lay this out. Again, since this is the animal video, I'm not going to go too heavy into how to do wheat, but basically just find some nice photo ref pieces of wheat. I'm not just making this wheat up. Before the video, I looked very closely at wheat. Never realized exactly the kind of detail that's in it. So I guess the motto to that is, when you're doing something and you need to know what it looks like, look at a photo, study it, and use it as your roadmap. Especially, you know, if you've got it, you can study it. Okay, at the end of this videotape, you'll be able to see the finished product and see exactly where I went with the wheat and whatnot, changing the color of it just slightly here. I'll probably throw actually a little bit of shadow into the wheat. If you see my first video, I talk about doing bolts. Well, actually each one of these stems should have a little life of its own, so to say. All right. Well, here's where I leave you. Let's take this photo down. Notice the difference. What we did is we did scratching techniques for the first one. We were taking things away. On this one, we were adding things. So the difference between transparent painting and opaque painting. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have learned quite a bit. Get that blank board, get it in front of you, and create. Rob Pryor, we'll see you.